In addition to everything else, we would also like to formally announce and welcome you all back to a very important day here at Ivdm. On March 19th, 2020, we did receive news that we were, by order of the state, required to close due to the current pandemic. Well, as of this coming Wednesday, the 14th of April, we are going to be reopening. So after just over a year's time, we are very glad and very excited to welcome you all back in person to the Imperial Valley Desert Museum. And we'll be actually having a grand reopening for this event the next week on the 21st. So we do invite you to come on down and see just how the museum has grown and all the new content and programming we have available for you, and are excited to share with you as well. My name is Dr. David Breckner. I'm the Executive Director of Ivdm. And if you were here normally, you'd be having the chance to meet the rest of our very capable and energetic staff who have been working hard over these months to keep this content and keep these opportunities coming to you. Our new hours upon reopening this Wednesday will be Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. We are shortening it by 1 hour to provide staff the time necessary to do a deep clean and to reset the facility for you starting the next day. Also very excited to share with you that the Ivdm is taking every precaution to ensure the safety of you, our guests, during the pandemic. This means that all staff, as of today, have been vaccinated for COVID-19, and we will actually be offering a COVID-19 vaccination clinic for our local residents here next Thursday as well. The Evening with an Expert speaker series here is probably, I hope, our last one that's going to be dictated only to an online audience, but nevertheless, moving forward, these will be made available for you online and recorded so they can be referred back to later. So we can keep this wisdom and the experience of Peter here for others to enjoy after the fact. Peter's presentation here today is one in several upcoming presentations. Starting next Saturday and then continuing through to early June, to the early June and the end of May, we have the Red Cross Be Red Cross Ready presentation program. This is meant for households to learn and identify the different threats and challenges in our own land of extremes. Everything from flash floods to heat waves to earthquakes, and how we as individuals, as families, and as a community can work together to plan and adapt and survive these crises. Now, with all that in mind, we're going to get underway here. I would ask, and speaking with Peter here, we'd ask that if you have a question tonight, please just feel free to use the reaction button on the bottom of your screen here. You should see that there's a little icon labeled reaction, and click any of those, including the raise hand, as you can see right here on my screen. And that will tell us that you have a question. And as soon as we hit a good pause, we will invite you to ask away. If you do not have a microphone or anything of that sort, please feel free to use the chat, and I'm happy to ask on your behalf as well. I'll be emceeing here while Peter does the presentation this evening. And with that in mind, I would like to turn the presentation over tonight to our featured speaker, Peter DeJongh. Peter first came to us in the Imperial Valley just under a year or so ago here now, July 2020. Chose a great time, great month to be joining the Imperial Valley. And I'm sure, is looking forward to the coming of those summer heats again. Before this, Peter was working in Oregon and also had experience in Wyoming, Alaska, and even Peru. His background includes land management, conservation, wildlife biology, and more of a botany aspect as well. So he is a Renaissance man, jack of all trades, and with a wide breadth of experience and perspective, and he's bringing those energies now to our own local deserts. Peter, thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Breckner. Yeah, thank you all for attending. It's good to see some faces out there, and it's really, really good to be here and actually get to interface with you guys, finally. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to make sure that you can all see it. So go ahead, let's practice a little bit. If you can see the screen, I'm going to pull up my participants tab here so I can see what if you guys can see my presentation, just go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Just as a reminder, it's down at the bottom right. All right. Got a couple of thumbs ups. There's a little reactions tab. Okay, awesome. All right, thanks, Mary. Thanks, Carrie. Great. Okay, looks like you're seeing me here. All right, so yeah, starting us off again, as David said, thank you, Deanie. Yeah, I'm Peter DeJongh. I'm the wildlife biologist for the El Centro BLM, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the critters that we manage and how I go about managing it as a BLM wildlife biologist. So starting off, I have this sort of collage screen that I really enjoy. I'd like to ask if anybody can name any of these species that they say in here. Go ahead and type it in chat, or if you want, you can unmute and just shout it out. But I think this is a really great slide that kind of captures the diversity that somebody, even myself coming down from Central Oregon, didn't necessarily expect, moving to this from the high desert to the low desert, where we think of it as such a more of a barren ecotype. But in reality, the diversity down here is just amazing. So yeah, if anybody can name any of these critters, just go ahead and type it in the chat or shout it out. Otherwise, I'll move right along. I'd like to just highlight a few of these that I've been working with. There's some of our more hot button species, and I'll just give you a little bit of background as well, so we're all on the same page. Oops. Okay, so really quickly, just so you all understand it, this is the boundaries of our field office. You can see the purple line around the outside. This is the extent of the land, the public land that we manage. That star right in the middle, that's our field office. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner as well, that's sort of where we are in the grand scope of California and the West here. And everything that you see in yellow on this slide is public land that is managed by our field office. That's within that black line boundary. So we have a ton of land that we manage, and our directive essentially is to manage this for multiple use. So we're managing it for energy development, we're managing it for wildlife conservation, we're managing it for recreation, so the public can get out and enjoy these lands. Is that a wolf choya? Wolf's choya. Thanks, Carrie. It's a munt's choya. But that's a really good guess. So again, yeah, we have a lot of public lands to manage here and for a lot of different resources. So basically what dictates how I go about managing the wildlife and the plants on these public lands are dictated through our land use plan. So this is essentially where we get our directives and where we're able to update, how we manage these lands. So this is everything from the projects that I can move forward with on these lands to further wildlife conservation and our sort of botany focused plant conservation projects, and also how we move forward with other recreation or energy development or any other human activities or human developments. They're all sort of dictated through these plans. These are long, they're multiple hundreds of pages long. There's a lot of information in it. So just to give you a sense of what a BLM biologist goes through is if you're coming into the federal system or if you're moving through field offices like I did last year, the first thing that I did was start digging into these to know exactly how our field office managed these lands. So another aspect that I need to be thinking about when I'm managing these wildlife or managing these resources is the legislation that's coming down. And that comes down from the administration, that comes down from Congress, and it comes down through these legislative acts like the Endangered Species Act, which some of you may already be familiar with. Essentially, it outlines a list of endangered and threatened species that need extra conservation attention, and it's overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the regulatory agency here. So while BLM are the on-the-ground managers of these public lands, we do communicate with, coordinate with, and consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service whenever we have to do with species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And these are also incorporated into our land use plans as well, as you'll see our Imperial Sand Dune Management Plan right there. So this is a quick list. These are the threatened and endangered species that we deal with here on the field office, and deal with is not really the right term. These are the ones that I have the privilege to try and conserve and restore. But this may seem like a short list, guys, but the extent of the range that we have on this field office means that I'm working with these guys a lot. So just as a point of comparison, when I'm coming down from Oregon, I had a couple of species that I very rarely interacted with as their habitat was very localized. We have species on here like the peninsular bighorn, like the desert tortoise, that have larger home ranges, and we want to be thinking about a lot when we're moving forward with development projects or recreation, OHV race, for example, or even when I'm planning a restoration project, I want to be thinking about what impacts that would have to these species. So I'm going to start out, I'm talking about a few of these hot button species. I'm going to start out with one that you may or may not be familiar with. It's the Mojave desert tortoise. It's Gopherus agazii. And it is federally threatened. It's been listed since 1990. And I do want to ask really quick, who here in attendance has seen a desert tortoise? Just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you've never seen one. All right, I got a couple thumbs up. Carrie's seen one. Mary's seen one. David, you've seen one. Awesome. Great. Now, how many of you have seen one in the wild? Go ahead and give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Carrie, awesome. All right, we got another one. Great. Well, I'm envious of you guys because I have yet to see one in the wild. I've become very close. I've seen burrows, I've seen scat, I've seen tracks. I have not yet seen a live desert tortoise. And just so I'm going to go through a little bit of brief ecology here. They're a long-lived species. Generally in the wild, they live about 50 years, but in captivity, they can live 80 years or even more, which is pretty remarkable. They spend most of their life underground, as you can likely sympathize. It's a bit of a harsh environment out here. So they rely on digging burrows to thermoregulate so they stay out of the harshest temperatures during the day and during the year. They rely on moisture retention as well to sort of stay hydrated and stay healthy. And as part of my job, we manage not only development projects, but I take into account various threats that are impacting the species. And this is everything from military and border patrol use, OHV recreation, exotic pet trade is a concern out here. These guys make really, really popular pets, but they also live very, very long. So occasionally we do see people essentially poaching the species for pets. And a big one here is raven predation, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. But the biggest concern for us as land managers is habitat connectivity. So while we can handle a certain amount of individual species, what we want to know as land managers, not knowing exactly where each individual tortoise is at a given time, is how we can manage the habitat that's going to be the most sustainable moving forward to sustain those tortoise populations. So here's where you can most likely find the tortoise in our field office. You can see out on the east side, we've got these designated critical habitat, and this is designated from a huge analysis of a lot of information that goes into the recovery plan by the Fish and Wildlife Service, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later. But essentially, you can see here that we have this chunk of land out here that is designated critical habitat. And this doesn't mean that you're only going to find tortoise in these particular blocks, of highlighted land. As you can see here, this is a model by the US Geological Survey. They basically used a number of different parameters like distance to human development, distance to water, slope, habitat, vegetative ecotype, to model the habitat that would be appropriate for this species. And they came up with this. So you can see it's larger than that designated critical habitat polygon that we saw in the last slide, just flipping back here. And this translates down to what we manage for. And it's essentially this large swath. So if I'm worrying about if something is going to impact a desert tortoise, I'm thinking about that area of land that's east of those imperial sand dunes, because those are the areas that are not only appropriate habitat for tortoise, but that they do attempt to expand out of at certain times. And so, mostly what I'm thinking about is how are various developments going to impact the tortoise? And what can I do as a biologist in El Centro to limit the impacts to these species. And as a fun fact, we do see the tortoise here. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor munching on a little annual forb there. This is really, really important for them to obviously gain nutrients and also retain moisture. And they do have, I'll share this tidbit, they do have this defense mechanism called voiding, where they essentially void their bladder to try and scare away different predators. And this is actually really dangerous because this means they're much more prone to dehydration. And that is one of the primary concerns that they have out here, is regulating that moisture content and that hydration. So that's why if we ever do need to handle a desert tortoise, we want to be trained in exactly how to do it to avoid that defensive response that could put them in that much more danger. So this is based not only on habitat, but also some incidental observations. And I've included down here, an incidental observation is essentially when you stumble upon a tortoise, right? You're out there doing something else, you're out looking for really cool cultural artifacts, or you're out seeing if you can spot cactus wrens, and you stumble upon a tortoise because you're extraordinarily lucky. And I have not been that lucky yet, but it is going to happen one of these days. But those incidental observations are reported to us. It's recorded by me and the other land management agencies out here. And that goes into our data set that informs how we think about where these guys are and how we can best manage the activities that are going on in our public lands. So this is kind of a summary of the best practices. And what I do as a BLM wildlife biologist is I look at a development project that's going on. Let's say it's an exploratory mining project, or it's a solar development, or it's an OHV race, like an ATV race. These are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about and that I'm going to maybe work into the project design to ensure that the impacts to tortoise are minimized, or eliminated as best as we can. So going through these really quick, we want to ensure that people are able to spot a tortoise. So if you are working on, hauling heavy equipment out to a gravel pit or a mining operation, you want to be driving slow enough so that you can spot a tortoise and stop in time. Checking under parked vehicles. As you guys know, it gets extraordinarily hot out here in the summer, and a nice shady alcove under a big truck looks really inviting to a lot of our critters that are trying to thermoregulate in that harsh environment. So we sometimes pass out these cards to workers that are under there to remind them, just give it a quick glance under those trucks and other vehicles, so you can make sure that you're not going to harm a tortoise when you're drying out inadvertently. Food and garbage, this is a really big one. So we know that you may have seen ravens out in a lot of our areas. They are a native species, but they are also opportunists. So what that means is they'll take advantage of whatever resources they can find. And in a lot of cases, this includes the refuse that's left behind by folks that go out and either accidentally leave something behind, or are a little bit careless and can leave something like food scrap or garbage or that sort of thing, and that can attract ravens. That's a source of food to them. So when we bring them out and they're introduced to an area, especially in tortoise habitat, not only is that garbage a source of food, but the tortoise that they find around, those are also sources of food as well. And when we're thinking about the recovery of a threatened species like the tortoise, we do want to ensure that we're not introducing new raven populations, new predators into those previously unoccupied areas where the tortoise thrive, because that's going to be another barrier to recovering that species. Finally, if they are on that endangered species list, public harassment, collection of the tortoise is illegal. And I do encourage that if you see a tortoise, you should be extremely excited. Take your pictures, but do keep your distance, because if you approach it or touch it, we could end up with that void response like we talked about earlier. Which really endangers them and lowers their chances of survival. But I just wanted to give you guys a picture of part of the work that I do to conserve this tortoise on a day-to-day basis, on a project-by-project basis. I'm always thinking about this, and I'm talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service as that regulatory agency the whole time. So we have a great relationship with them, and keeping that dialogue open is essential to both of our jobs. So the recovery plan is something that they publish. You can go online, you can Google it and read it if you'd like. And it essentially it's the plan to recover the tortoise long-term. And it boils down to these three main points. These are the three main objectives of the point. Maintain self-sustaining populations. So essentially, we don't want to be relying on human rehabilitation and reintroduction. We want them to be proliferating by themselves in the wild. We want them to be well distributed. That's objective number 2. We maintain a range, right? And the big one for us is we're ensuring that habitat is protected and managed for long-term population viability. So we ensure that that habitat is healthy and it's going to sustain those populations and encourage those well-distributed and self-sustaining populations that we talked about. So I do see a question here. If we see a tortoise on the road, don't you recommend moving it off the road? No. And this is a really, really great question. I would recommend reporting it because there's a very specific way that we're trained to handle tortoises. And again, it boils down to whether or not we're going to initiate that voiding response that is going to make its survival that much less likely once we move it off that road. So if I'm making a recommendation, it's going to be to allow the tortoise to move of its own volition. If you cannot do that, you know, I would call the Fish and Wildlife Service. I would call the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and get a trained biologist out there to move the tortoise. Obviously, we don't want to see any road mortalities. They are common, unfortunately. I am going to talk about that a little bit more often, but having folks out there just picking them up and moving them off the road can be harmful in many respects. So if you do have the opportunity, obviously we prefer that they're not on the road, but if you have the opportunity to let that tortoise leave of its own volition, that is the way to go. So recovery actions. This is part of the meat of that recovery plan. We do have the recovery implementation team. This is a team of subject matter experts from various agencies. And they do have this list of projects that we're trying to get at that is going to help us in recovering the species. So these include seed collection that's going to be beneficial for moving forward with habitat restoration, reducing measures to reduce OHV and vehicle disturbance in wilderness. So that can be things like establishing gates or signs, educating the public, outreach events, stuff like this, where we can sort of discuss the ecology and discuss the best practices. And additionally, raven subsidy project reduction and fencing and culverts. So those fencing, that's essentially a method in which we keep tortoises out of common construction areas, your gravel pits, your exploratory mining projects. You can put up a fence that's going to ensure that you don't have tortoises wandering in there for those long-term projects that's going to put them in danger. And culverts, I'm going to chat about in just a second, but essentially they let a tortoise skirt a road, like cross a road without putting it in additional danger. So what I'd like to do, some projects that I have in mind as your, El Centro BLM wildlife biologist. One thing I'm working on, burrow gatherers and management. These guys, they are protected, wild horse and burrow. They are, widely regarded as culturally relevant, the symbol of the American West, but the management is very, very important. We have what's called herd management areas where we ensure that the population levels are not getting out of control. And unfortunately, right now, they are above those levels. So if we can manage these populations to reduce their impact on the habitat, they are very prevalent. If you do frequent the areas on the lower Colorado River, you've probably seen some of these guys, but their impact to the habitat is significant, and we are working to sort of humanely gather these guys and maintain those ideal herd management levels that is going to keep the habitat balanced so that other species like the desert tortoise can subsist out there. Now, my second bullet point here, integrate transportation ecology findings. That's what I was getting at with that culvert point that I mentioned just a second ago. There's a lot of work being done as part of that resource implementation team to model where tortoise are going to move, where the areas of high traffic are going on, and where we can prioritize those sorts of culvert projects to reduce the impacts to tortoise. So essentially, how can we use our observation data to inform where we put that wildlife corridor in so we can place it that the most tortoises are going to be able to safely cross a highway, cross a road without injury. So that's, that's another big focus of that resource implementation team, and something that I'm looking at moving forward as a potential project for the areas in our field office that are in appropriate habitat for tortoise. And then finally, wilderness area restoration and rehab. This is, there have been a ton of additions and changes in terms of our wilderness areas, and there's, there are a lot of established roads and trails that actually go into our wilderness that aren't authorized, but there's, it's the communication that I plan on working on, installing things like gates and signs, doing outreach events, working with our law enforcement or recreation staff to ensure that when we're making public contact, we can communicate what is and what is not open, so we can avoid having additional impacts to that really important habitat that's in those restoration and wilderness areas. So now that we know kind of what I'm doing with desert tortoise, I'm going to switch gears right now. I'm going to talk about a plant. And it's actually an extremely cool plant, and it's very relevant to the work that I do out here. This is Pearson's milkvetch. It is endangered under the California Endangered Species Act, and it's threatened under the Federal Species Act. So, if you're familiar with the idea annually, it's growing, flowering, seeding, and dying in 1 year as an annual. But if conditions are right, certain individuals can live up to 5 years, which is what we call perennial. They can seed, one individual can seed more than one time. And they're responsible, those individuals that make it that long are the ones that are responsible for the most proliferation out here. So it's extremely, it's a harsh environment out here. The dunes where these guys live, it's a very high mortality rate. And I'm going to show you in just a minute kind of what it looks like, but they're extremely reliant on precipitation. So we're tracking very, very stringently, we're tracking the precipitation that's occurring in the dunes, so we can ensure that we know exactly how many milkvetch to expect and that we might be monitoring. So jumping ahead here, this is a picture of a bunch of seedlings. And again, mortality is so high that maybe a couple of these guys or none of them is going to make it to the next year. So, when we're out here monitoring, and I'm gonna talk about a monitoring event presently, but we are thinking about, it's a numbers game, right? The more recruitment that we see like this, the greater the chance that we're gonna get additional species proliferation in the future. So I do have a question here. The difference in the reasons for differences in special status between the California and the Federal Endangered Species Act. So essentially, the BLM is a federal agency, and we act with the Fish and Wildlife Service. California and each state have their own regulations and requirements on how you're going to manage the resources within that state. So California has what's called CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And on the federal level, we have NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And these are the pieces of legislation that dictate how we evaluate the impacts to resources, how we allow public to comment on the resources and have public say on what's going to happen there. And these are present based on land ownership in a lot of cases. So if you are going to perform a project or development on state land, you're going to deal with CEQA and the special status species that are listed under that state Endangered Species Act. And if you're developing on public land, you're going to deal more with NEPA and what the Federal Endangered Species Act. So yeah, it's basically just state versus federal attitudes towards conservation. And there's a ton of communication here between myself and the state biologists. You know, we're working together on so many of these projects, especially because in a lot of these areas, the land ownership is checkerboarded. So, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, but we have a lot of communication between agencies so we can best manage these species moving forward. So here's some pictures that I just took a couple weeks ago. This is our annual monitoring effort for the milk fetch. It's out in the dunes. As you can see, we're all masked up, but this is an effort that's really close and dear to my heart, particularly because I actually get to go out and do it. And that's huge for me to have that opportunity to get out in the field. It's amazing. Essentially, we're evaluating based on the precipitation that's coming through on any given year, how many macro plots we're monitoring out in these dunes. So we have up to 19 macro plots that are spread throughout the dune complex that allow us to get a picture on the health of the milk vetch populations. And based on the amount of precipitation, if we get a ton, we're going to monitor more plots. If we get more of an average amount, we have a set number of 6 plots like we did this year to properly evaluate the health of the species. And these are some of my favorite pictures. They really give a picture, sort of an example of what it's like to be out there. And we have a few more. So a big part of what we're doing for these, like what BLM is doing for this species, is managing the OHV activities that's going on out there in the dunes. You can see on the top right here, we have closures. We have this wilderness area up here where there's no authorized motorized activities. And we do have in the dune complex as well. That leaves a ton of open area for recreation while allowing us to protect the central areas that's really important to the survival of the species. And this is done again in cooperation with Fish and Wildlife Service, so they know exactly what we're doing. And I personally produce this annual report at the end of every year that I send to the Fish and Wildlife Service to just make sure that we're all informed and we can all move forward knowing the extent of the species and how it's doing out there. So, you know, this is really, really important too. And I have to shout out our recreation folks, our law enforcement, for getting out there, making public contacts, helping to explain what's going on to folks, and the huge effort that goes into maintaining these closure signs. You can see over here, the extent of this area is massive, and these guys do so much good work making sure that it's very well visible and very well maintained for everybody that's recreating out there. So what am I wanting to do with this species in general? We have a few pretty exciting things coming down the pipeline here, and one of them is drone monitoring. So, you know, I'm excited and I'm apprehensive of this at the same time, and I'm excited because this is a technology that could potentially give us a much broader picture of what's going on the dunes on a much larger scale with much less work. I'm apprehensive because it means I might not get to go out for that week and monitor in the dunes like I love doing. But currently we do have a team. They're working out of the University of Nevada in Reno, and they're working on an algorithm that can essentially program a drone to go out, take a video, recognize the milk vetch, and map it with a lot of those data that are really important to us over a large scale. So you can see here, you know, this is from a really old large scale study. We could end up with really up-to-date data of what's going on out here, and we could build a temporal series with that data, how they're doing year to year, compare those to climatic or stochastic influences, and really see what's going on with that species. It'd be extremely exciting. So kind of transitioning out of the milk fetch, I do want to emphasize that sensitive plant species are a priority for us as well. And we have a number of these that are out in the dunes and throughout our field office. And this is something that I'm thinking about when we're working with a project proponent. I'm thinking about, you know, what are the impacts going to be to these species that are a little bit more sensitive? And so here we have on our left, we've got the Algodones Dune sunflower, we've got the giant Spanish needle. And can anybody tell me what this plant in the middle is? I may have cut it off a little bit. Carrie, I know you know, but if anybody does know, go ahead and write it in the chat or give me a thumbs up and you can unmute. Give you just a second here. What are we thinking? Okay, I think I see Mary, you're shaking your head no. This is a really fascinating species. It's called sand food. And it's not only is it just totally bizarre, this is a flowering plant species. It's not a mushroom. A lot of folks might look at it and think it's a mushroom, but no, you can see these tiny flowering areas on the top of this plant. This is also a culturally relevant species. This was literal sand food to some of the indigenous groups in this area. And I do know one man who has eaten it. He says it tastes like sand. So if I ever do have the opportunity within a controlled environment, obviously I don't want you all to go eating all of our sensitive plant species, but it is just kind of a fun fact that I like to think about when I'm out there. Again, another sort of common practice with a botany practice that I get to do, and again, it's really fun working down here because I get to wear the wildlife hat and the botany hat, but we get to permit the legal collection of these plants and species. We do have a number that are taken illegally, unfortunately. And this doesn't only impact the plant species that's being taken, it impacts the wildlife species that rely on these plants for resources. And that can be your peninsular bighorn sheep that rely on these cacti. It can be your pollinator species, which are more and more of a hot button issue these days. Thinking about the bees, the monarchs. There are real consequences for unauthorized collection, but we do, if you are looking to take cordwood, you can contact the BOM and I can work out with you a legal permit to do that. But that's just, I've probably seen 3 or 4 of these since I got here. It's not super common, but there is a process to go through. All right, I'm excited about this one. So this is a flat-tailed horned lizard, and you probably didn't see it on that, well, you definitely didn't see it on that list of threatened and endangered species. And that's because it's not. And this is an extremely cool lizard. So I have a quick question for you guys. If anyone has heard of this lizard, I want you to give me a thumbs up if you think it can shoot blood from its eyes. This is something that we say. I see Mary in there shaking her head. Give me a thumbs down if you don't think so. Let's see if we got a heart. Is that a yes? It's an appropriate response. Okay, so the answer, guys, is no. But there's a bit of a caveat there. These guys, a quick ecology. They're small. They're pretty docile. You hear a lot. Horny toad, that's kind of a colloquial term for them. I heard that all the way from Wyoming to Oregon to down here. They're not toads, they are lizards. And they're also not the lizards that you see scampering around out there. I'm gonna turn a light on really quick here. I think it's getting a bit dark. Hopefully you can still see me. But this particular species, this is Phrynosoma macallii. Some other species in the genus can shoot blood from their eyes. Wild, a very cool defense mechanism, not this species. This species relies mostly on camouflage. So if they are spooked, if they are feeling threatened, in a lot of cases, they'll bury themselves in the sand and they actually become extraordinarily hard to see. You have to be aware of, what their tracks look like, what sort of sand characteristics you can see to really track these guys down. It's pretty remarkable. They eat mostly ants. So when I'm evaluating habitat, I'm evaluating where their food source is, and that's ants. They don't need a perennial water source. They get it mostly through the ants. And it's remarkable because you can actually find scat from these guys out in the desert, pick it up, break it apart, it crumbles into pure ant carapaces. It's just ants. That's all that they're eating out there. So essentially, as I mentioned, they thermoregulate by burying under the sand. They like sandy, rocky, sparsely vegetated habitat. When I got here, one biologist said, just so you know, if you see any sort of tree or anything that's like above your chest, there's no flat tail there. So they do like those spread out environments. And as far as predation, what eats these things? It's just about everything. Maybe not your tortoise. But these guys, you can see on my left hand of my screen, that's a sidewinder. They'll definitely go for it. The ravens will definitely go for it. Predation is a threat to this species. But another big one, as has become kind of a common theme here, it's human development. It's that habitat fragmentation, right? We're talking about it a lot. There's been a lot of agricultural, residential, and energy development. Renewable energy is a big thing right now. Definitely has its benefits, but we are also worried about fragmenting the habitat of these species. OHV use and other recreation, and climate change, of course, is kind of always this ever-present threat that's altering not only the climatic conditions on the ground, but the vegetative communities that these species rely on. So why do we care about these guys? They're not on that list that I said earlier, right? So why are we talking so much about them? Well, I do a ton of work with this species, and that's because they are in trouble as well. So much so that they've been proposed to be listed on that endangered species list 3 times. And so far, they haven't been found warranted, which is great, right? Because it means that we're conserving the species to a degree that those populations are remaining stable. And I'm going to tell you why that's happening and what we're doing about it. But there is some debate among conservationists, about how we best protect the species. But essentially, why I'm so concerned about it and why BLM and CDFW is so concerned about it is that we're keeping them off that endangered species list, outside of being an extremely cool little lizard in its own right. But here, this is just a quick slide. I'm going to illustrate how much the range has shrunk for these guys. You can see in this top right corner here, the dotted line is outlining the historic extent of the species. So you can see in Southern California, there's been this massive fragmentation of that habitat and that range. The pink is what's currently considered the range of this species. So you can see right down through the middle of the Imperial Valley and right in here. If you live in the valley, you know there's a lot of agricultural development, there's a lot of urban development here, and it has understandably impacted the species. So it's one of the reasons that we are concerned about how the populations are doing out here. So the biggest, and this is a monumental effort. This was extremely cool for me to arrive in and sort of see this. But there's this effort called the Interagency Coordinating Committee, and it was established in 1997. And it's essentially this group of land management agencies. You've got everything from the BLM, us, multiple different offices. You've got the Navy, you've got the Fish and Wildlife Service, you've got the Bureau of Reclamation, you've got the state agencies, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Arizona Fish and Wildlife. We're all working together to try and conserve and protect this species and working on its recovery. So, we have regular meetings together. I'm the secretary of this group. Our office, El Centro, we manage the largest amount of habitat for the flat-tailed horned lizard out of any of the ICC members. And it's an incredible group to be a part of. And this is one of the big reasons why we've been able to keep this species off the list, is this coordinated effort across agencies to make that happen. So basically what this group has done is created a management strategy. And into that, we built all the different strategies that we want moving forward to conserve the species. We want to maintain those self-sustaining populations. We want to support the academic community and the research moving forward so we can be better informed. We're limiting disturbance in key areas. We call them management areas. I'm going to show them to you in just a moment. But we're limiting that disturbance to 1%, and that's not yearly, that's not annual, it's 1%. That's how we're trying to really limit the disturbance to the habitat that these species rely on. So, in addition, there are a number of management considerations that go into this. Compensation for habitat loss. Money goes into land acquisition, more habitat that we can manage for the conservation of the species, or into the restoration of other areas of habitat. So a big point here, guys, is that in 2004, the range-wide management strategy was incorporated into our BLM's land use plan. And you'll remember that from one of those first slides, those multi-100-page documents that dictate, how we manage the land out here. We incorporated this strategy into those documents, which essentially means I'm required to do these actions. We're required to perform these conservation actions and protect the species. So that's huge for us. So here, this is just a quick slide. We can show some of the areas that have been donated or exchanged to acquire lands in flat-tail habitat. You'll notice these hash marks down here. These are our management areas. I'm going to give you a better shot at them in just a moment. But you can see that we've targeted lands for acquisition around here. And that just gives us more contiguous habitat to manage. So here's a map of the distribution, and each of those little dots, you'll notice those green dots, is an observation for flat-tail. And these red polygons are mapped appropriate habitat for the species. So this goes into just determining our management areas, which are, again, these hashed areas. You'll see down here in the bottom left, the Ohv Basin, the West Mesa, and the East Mesa, which are the 3 management areas that the El Centro BLM manages. Up in this top left, you'll notice Ocotillo Wells, and you'll see one thing I mentioned earlier in the talk, there's a lot of checkerboarded land ownership in here. That blue land, that's owned by the state. So they kind of take the lead on managing the species there, but they are part of that interagency coordinating committee. So we're talking to them daily. I talked to their biologist last week. And so what we do in these management areas is we're getting out there every single year and we're monitoring. We're monitoring demography, which is essentially how many lizards are at any given are in a given point, within that plot. That gives us an idea of how that population is doing, how healthy is it, how populous is it. We're monitoring occupancy, and that's spread out throughout the plot. If I jump back here, you're going to have 75 occupancy plots throughout this this management area here, and that's going to give us an idea over time and how the spatial distribution of the lizard is faring. And I can compare that to a stochastic event like a climate event or a seismic event or a development. Say you have a solar project going up nearby. If I see a response from the critter over time, that informs how we can move forward and manage those types of projects and how we can manage recovery actions for the species. So these data are extraordinarily valuable. And here's just another slide reiterating, what are we talking about here with these data? How are populations changing over time? Are there any trends or correlations that we can identify? And this really, really importantly, guys, helps us inform our defense, so to speak, our response if there is a proposal for these guys to be listed. We're able to look at the data and say, okay, is that really warranted? Are we in agreement that the species is ready to go on the list for more stringent regulation and management? Or do we think that based on the data, based on solid defensible data, can we say that the management actions that we're taking are working, right? And they're helping recover that species. So that's, these data are absolutely integral. Really quickly, it's not just monitoring. We do have active projects out here on the ground. We're always completing signage for these management areas to ensure that folks know where they can recreate. We do outreach through production and distribution of maps. You can go on our website and find maps that you can download to your phone that you can, track in real time where you're at and ensure you're not making an incursion into these management areas. And again, our law enforcement, I have to shout them out. They're making those public contacts. They're talking with me. They're talking with the public. They're doing those, those educating actions, having those conversations about why these closures are in effect and the benefit of doing that. So that's hugely important. And then finally, there are restoration projects involved, invasive species removal, youth group engagement, getting them out there to sort of rehabilitate some of those areas that have been previously disturbed, that sort of thing. So that's all hugely helpful. And so what am I trying to do next? So the future directions here, we want to continue these monitoring and data efforts because they give us the tools that we need to better manage the species. And I'm extremely excited about a couple of these, this genomic data collection and this reproduction study. These are two things that we're considering implementing for moving forward. Genomic data, it's sort of the data of the future right now. We can take a small blood or tissue sample and we can turn that into just this library worth of data. It's incredible. We can use that to analyze gene flow. Where are these individuals coming from over time? How are populations shifting and moving? You know, what sort of diversity do we have at a genetic level between populations? So valuable. I'm really, really excited about that. And then reproduction, you know, how can we support the academic community and our other committee members in their efforts to gain more data and information about the species? We are moving forward with a reproduction study that is going to help us understand how they reproduce. You know, we can track over time if there's climatic influences on production, that sort of thing. It's going to give us so much information. We're really, really excited about it. And thank you, David, for posting the Avenza maps. Yeah, that's an amazing resource. I highly encourage you guys to check it out. All right, so the last species I want to kind of really focus in on, I'm going to switch gears again. Hopefully you're still tracking, and I'm not losing you here. But this is the desert pupfish. This is a really, really interesting species, not one that I expected moving down to the low desert, where I anticipated dunes and dried out plants and, you know, maybe a slow moving reptile or two. But we have these little fish that are out here and they're surviving, and they are really, really interesting in their own right. This is the desert pupfish. They've been federally endangered since 1986. And they're beautiful. These are two, you know, you can see in the top left here, these are two males of the species. They're this bright blue. The females are a little bit smaller and are kind of mottled and striped. Very, very interesting to see. And over here on the right, you can see this is legitimately, guys, I took this picture. This is a perennial stream. This is flowing every year. And this is where these guys live, in the middle of the desert. It's truly amazing. So, you know, why are these guys endangered? Well, again, I'm a broken record. It's habitat reduction and fragmentation, right? You can see in these top pictures here, there's, you know, there's agricultural development, there's urbanization, there's things that alter not only the physical land space, but the watershed, right? Which these guys do depend on. So it's huge, and it's not always as apparent as some of the other species when it, you know, human development is going to influence the system. So we're also worried about invasive species, and there are kind of two angles here. There are invasive fish or introduced fish that are going to compete for resources within that stream system. And there's also invasive plants, which we can see in these right to the center picture and this right picture. You can see some tamarisk there, that's salt cedar. That is a species that's guzzling up water. They are invasive. They're edging out native plants and they're guzzling up water, which is reducing the water table here and shrinking that habitat for our pupfish. And I do want to shout out Sharon Keeney here. She's with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. She is the pupfish guru. She's just such a source of information. And the partnership between our two agencies has been extraordinarily beneficial for both of us. So what are we doing about these guys? I'm really excited to show you something here, but I am going to start with a really, really new development. We started a working group, and that's basically between us, between the Fish and Wildlife Service, between CDFW and other stakeholders that are working to conserve this species. And this means we share data, we help each other out with grants and letter of support. We coordinate our activities to ensure that, you know, the consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service moves through. We keep that dialogue open so we know that we can do what needs to be done to restore this habitat to protect the species. Another big thing that we're working on and that I'm currently working on is evaluating the hydrology out here, right? This is such a different system. We need to know what the water's doing. They rely on it to live. So we're currently working with the US Geological Survey to install monitoring wells out here that give us a picture over time of what's going on in that water table. How is it fluctuating and why? What's it responding to? Is there seismic activity? Is there, you know, a new agricultural development going up nearby that's going to influence that system? That's really, really important to informing how we manage this system. And then finally, like tamarisk removal, it's huge, right? I already went over how the tamarisk are impacting the system. And so I do want to share something with you guys that I've been really, really excited about. I'm going to show you here. Hopefully you can see this. This is a browser. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you see this checkerboarded map that I'm showing you. All right, Carrie, thank you very much. So this, guys, is a project that was completed in January. And thanks, David. Essentially, I was able to, there were 2 interns through one of our national programs, interns that were working with the BLM that were available to me for this project for just 2 weeks. They were incredible couple of young biologists who were able to go out and collect all these data on the tamarisk populations out there, but not just that, things like flow rate, things like what wildlife were out there at the time and how we can access the channel. So I'm gonna zoom in for you guys here. And basically these guys went out with a tablet and a personal cell phone, and they were able to use this application called Collector that one of our district geographic information specialists developed for me, hugely helpful. Essentially, I was able to give them a list of the data that I wanted to collect, and they handed me back this tool that I could put into the hands of these young biologists, and they went out there and were able to collect all of these data for me day by day and seamlessly sync them to this system. Amazing. So I do want to sort of illustrate their work here. Here you can see the marsh complex. It's huge, you know, this is multiple miles of stream, and each of these polygons is mapped tamarisk. So you can see what we're working with here. We have our work cut out for us. This is a ton of tamarisk that we were thinking about treating, and it goes all the way up along San Felipe Creek and along the various washes here that are part of the system. And so not only did they map this tamarisk, all of these little dots are information on flow rate, you know, where there are pools forming, where there are indicators of flow, give us information on the hydrology of this system. And also, if I click on each of these polygons, they give me a ton of information on this particular area of tamarisk. So how dense is it? How contiguous, how accessible? Could I get a skid steer in there? Are there any wildlife present? This data from a management perspective is hugely helpful. This informs me, you know, is it contiguous enough for me to consider a prescribed burn? Is it accessible enough for me to consider getting a skid steer down there? So this is the first step in moving forward with that process before we start talking about, you know, what's possible and how can we ensure that it's not going to harm the species as we work to restore it. So I'm extremely excited about this. I've already used it to inform where to install those monitoring wells. It's so helpful. So I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint here. All right, hopefully we can all see that. Someone give me a thumbs up if they're good to go. Mary, I think I see you nodding there. Thank you for that. Thanks, Carrie. All right, so those are the focal species that I want to talk about, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm only focusing on them. We do have sensitive wildlife species as well, and a lot of these guys I'm extremely excited to work with. So here we see the peninsular bighorn sheep, desert bighorn. They're very interesting because the population of these guys that lives in the peninsular range between the valley and the coast are endangered. So it's really, really interesting because they're the population of these desert bighorns that we're focused on managing because they are declining. This is a Townsend's long-eared bats. I love bats. I'm extremely excited to work with them. I'm gonna show you really quick some future directions from me in just a moment. We also have the fringe-toed lizards here, and burrowing owls are one of our sensitive species. I love these guys. They either look just angry and outraged to see you, as you could see this guy right here, or they're just frankly not amused with what you're doing. That's what that expression says to me. But yeah, so all of these guys, if a project comes across my desk, I'm thinking about what impacts to these species could occur, and I'm including in project designs those measures that are going to protect these guys. So maybe a timing stipulation, maybe we avoid heavy construction during the nesting season for these burrowing owls, or maybe we stay away from the mine entrance that sustains the population of these Townsend's long-eared bats. All of those things are in consideration all the time for us. And it's really, really fun. Additionally, you know, some of these species aren't sensitive, but they are important, right? All of these species are part of the larger ecosystem and part of that larger trophic system that is sustaining everything. And these have recreative or cultural values as well. You have desert mule deer, important to hunters and local groups. We have even kangaroo rats, they're prey species, right? We do need to be thinking about them in the context of how they fit into that ecosystem and some of the species that rely on them for prey, and maybe their impact on the vegetative systems as well, maybe their seed dispersers. So that leads me to just sort of wrapping up here. These are some passion projects. These are things that I'm really excited about doing in the future. You see a canyon bat there on the left. I already mentioned that I love bats. I'm really excited to start doing some bat monitoring here. And you know, as COVID sort of becomes more and more under control, we can hopefully start doing some citizen science groups where we get people out to take part in that bat monitoring. I'm really excited about that. But we have over 18 species of bats here on our field office that I'm thinking about, and more data on how well they're dispersed, or where we can, say, put in a bat gate at a mine entrance that's sustaining a large population of bats. That's going to be extremely important to manage that species. And I'm really excited to sort of work with them and see what we have. You know, over here on the right, we've got the peninsular Bighorn Sheep. Love these guys. That's a really funny trail cam picture that we have. We do have collaring efforts. I'm working with California Fish and Wildlife to really know how these guys are responding to various influences. And you know, how their populations are doing. I'm talking about already getting out there and helping collar these guys and get those data for us. So extremely excited about that. And one, again, passion project of mine, the golden eagle. I worked with these guys up in Oregon. I love them. I think they're beautiful, charismatic, and they are protected, but we are seeing their populations wane a little bit. And I'm curious as to why that's happening. We do have a lot of different influences going on here. The advent of renewable energy, variations in prey species, which is why I included this jackrabbit here. We're worried about potential introduction of rabbit hemorrhagic disease. And while those species may not be range-wide in trouble or a species of conservation concern, those jackrabbits, they do sustain other populations and other species as well, such as this golden eagle. They're a prey species. So any impacts to that species reverberates through the entire ecosystem, right? So this is something that we're always thinking about, especially as climatic conditions change, new developments occur, and various diseases and other events are introduced. So finally, this is a plug that I always throw in here, how to keep your critters safe. I kind of went over this stuff already. You know, don't collect your plants and animals, keep your distance, enjoy them from the distance. Stay aware of how you're moving, giving wildlife space, keeping the desert clean, staying on those designated routes. And finally, if you do see anything particularly cool out there, feel free to call into your BLM office in El Centro and let me know. I love hearing about it. I love engaging the public, and I love having, those are good data for us as well. If we have location data, if we have prevalence or abundance data, that really helps me out as I'm thinking about managing those resources throughout the range. So again, you know, get out there, enjoy your public lands, and hopefully see some critters. So finally, I've included my my contact info there. Again, I encourage you to reach out to me. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. And just again, thank you guys for listening to me tonight. And it's really good to see you all. And hopefully I can make more contact with you guys in the future.
Peter, thank you so much. Really appreciate your efforts, your presentation, and all that you do, not just for the animals, but for us in these deserts here. It's not an easy job. It's an ever continuing effort, but I think your passion and the efforts and education outreach like this, hopefully will get us, move us in the right direction step by step further every day. At this point, I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has any questions for Peter. If you do, please just feel free to unmute yourself and just ask away.
Yeah, I would like to ask where the vetch was.
Where the milk vetch?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Martin. Those are they're located throughout the Imperial sand dune complex. So they run all the way from the north area in those North Algodones Dune Wilderness area, all the way down to the border. So again, where we monitor depends on how much precipitation we get, but those plants are prevalent throughout, and they're prevalent in a lot of those open areas as well. So if you do recreate out there, you can see them in a lot of those open areas. Yeah, they're a beautiful plant. They're very, very cool to see, but they're in the dunes. They're mostly on the north facing aspects. So those slopes that are facing north, that's generally where you'll find them in sort of some flat basin-like areas. They won't be on those steep slopes, but you'll definitely find them out there if you're looking for them. Thank you for the question.
Open?
Yeah, it's open.
Listen, I just want to compliment you. I learned an awful lot tonight. It was very instructive, very good. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Don. I really appreciate you coming out. It's good to see you guys, good to virtually meet you. Hopefully I can see you all again in person. All right, I see Carrie. For the flat-tailed horned lizard, would it be a benefit if it was listed on the ESA? That's a complicated question, and thank you for answering it. So first of all, if it's listed on the ESA, it means that it's in more trouble than it is right now. So first of all, that's an alarming road. You know, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's an alarming step in the road, so to speak. But it does mean more stringent regulation. It means that we're a lot more confined in our mission of multiple use. It means that for every action that we do out there on the land, be it development, be it recreation, or be it conservation, if I'm wanting to go out there and do that, the process by which I evaluate how I'm going to impact and how I'm going to move forward is a lot more intense. So it does limit what we're able to do out there from a certain standpoint. Yes, it does mean that there are more stringent conservation measures, but if we're working across agency to manage those already, and we have more public involvement, more flexibility in how we manage the species, that is a good thing. So hopefully we try and keep those off the lists as well as we can. Thank you for that question.
Peter, I had one for you here.
Yeah.
When it comes to, one of the best things we have about technology and just the way that people communicate these days is how interconnected we all can be and sharing information rather easily. I know that you have a ton of these studies going on where you are using data to map networks and to observe. is there any sort of mechanism for, say, somebody's outside, they see a desert tortoise? Is it possible, or is that desirable for you to receive reports about where these tortoise sightings are taking place, or any of the other endangered species in our region, just so you can get an idea from it?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question. If you do see any of these guys, I would love to hear about it. If you do have georeference devices, things that are going to give you location data on that animal, if you can get as much information as you can from those guys, if you can get pictures from a safe distance, of course, that's extremely helpful to me. It goes into a database that I keep, that I share with the Fish and Wildlife Service and with California Fish and Wildlife on where we're seeing tortoise. It helps track the species. It gives us more data to work with. I do want to make clear again with the exotic pet trade, the danger to these animals from certain influences, I would stay away from including any sort of georeferenced data or information if you're sharing it on social media, if you're putting out there to a larger audience. We don't necessarily want people to know exactly where our threatened species are at any moment of the day, in case, a lot of folks have really good intentions. They just want to go out there and see this rare animal. I do too. I'm so excited to see a desert tortoise. But, we do want to ensure that folks that may be a little bit less informed on how to best go about that encounter, avoid impacts to the species, and obviously we want to avoid any impact like a collection for an exotic pet or anything like that. So definitely reach out to me if you see anything cool. Even if you just see it, I love to hear from you. It's really fun to be able to interface with you guys. But yeah, if you have location data, if you have picture data, if you have, if you see some peninsular bighorn sheep out there, let me know how many lambs you see. Let me know how many adults. Are they rams? Are they ewes? That's just really great information for me to have and to share amongst the other agencies that are managing these species. So yeah, thank you for that question, David. That's a great question. And I'm seeing a follow-up. Okay, so Carrie's asking, how long does a tortoise live? Is it true they can live 100 years? No, it's not. So this is a really common misconception that I see and that I actually had before I came down here and learned more about the desert tortoise. Generally, in the wild, these guys live about 50 years. In captivity, they can push 80. But those 200 years old or tortoises, those are, more sub-Saharan Africa. And interestingly, a quick point, we do occasionally see those kind of tortoises out here. I know that doesn't make any sense, but essentially it's because people get these exotic pets. They're either too difficult to care for, or in some cases, amazingly, they outlive their owners, right? So you have these sub-Saharan African tortoises that are passed on through people's wills. And if someone doesn't want to take care of them, sometimes they'll release them out to the wild. So occasionally we do come across a large sub-Saharan African tortoise out here. I'll get a call and say, I've got a new world record for the desert tortoise. This thing is massive. And it turns out that it's been a released pet. But yeah, generally in the wild, you'll see about 50 years. In captivity, they can get up to 80. That's a good question. I think I saw another question here. Advice for inherited family pets. What can individuals do if they have one and no longer care for it? Great question. And thinking particularly about respiratory disease among household tortoises and the threat that they pose to wild populations. That's an amazing point. So you're going to want to get in contact with Fish and Wildlife Service. They rehab tortoises. They're also able to help place them at places like the Desert Museum that care for these critters, especially if they're not able to care for themselves in the wildland, wild environment if they've been domesticated. Those rehab programs are just amazing, and that's a fantastic question. But also respiratory disease, I want to highlight this. This is an extremely important point, not just for tortoise, but for a lot of different species like peninsular bighorn sheep, and for the rabbits, jackrabbits, and anything that can be exposed to these various diseases. Interface between domestic animals and wildlife is one of the huge threats to wildlife populations, because you bring domestic diseases into the wildlife populations. So a huge threat to bighorn sheep, for example, is intermingling with domestic sheep. They carry a lot of diseases that aren't taking it out where you're letting it roam, and if they're coming into contact with any kind of wild animals, because that is just a recipe for spreading disease, unfortunately. And again, you know, you want to be, if you're out there in the desert, if you come across something that looks a little unusual, you see a large number of dead rabbits, for example, take a little bit of care. Maybe, you know, clean your shoes off, clean your tires off if you've been driving through that area, hiking through that area. There are a lot of, remember, rabbit hemorrhagic disease that can spread extremely easily and impact prey populations and even household rabbits. If you were to take that back to a domestic rabbit, it could contract the disease and die as a result. So, you know, these are things that you really want to be thinking about. And it is very important to think about that interface between domestic and wild animals and keeping that to an absolute minimum. That's a great question, David. Thank you.
All right, very welcome. And do we have any final questions here for Peter tonight? Well then, Peter, I think I will thank you once again for this excellent presentation and for, of course, all the work that you and everyone else at the BLM El Central office are doing to preserve, interpret, and celebrate our deserts, making them accessible for both the native species as well as us when we go out and enjoy them.
All right, thank you guys so much. Thanks so much for showing up. Thanks. Thank you, Martin, and your partner there. Thanks, Don and Mary. Deanie, I really appreciate you guys coming out. If you do have any more questions for me, my contact information, again, I'll throw it up right here. But, you know, contact your local BLM office. We're so happy to hear from you. And again, just thanks for showing up and hearing me out.
And just to let everybody know, we will be continuing both the Evening with an Expert speaker series as well as other Be Red Cross Ready events across the remaining months of the spring and summer. And of course, we reopen our doors officially to you this coming Wednesday. So please do come on out. If you enjoyed this talk, show your support. We're happy to continue great programs like this in partnership with incredible organizations like the BLM. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
Thank you all. Good night.